Alrighty, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for carving out time to be here. The VMware User Group, or VMUG, is an independent, global, customer-led organization created to maximize members' use of VMware and partner solutions through knowledge, sharing, training, collaboration, and events. Please get connected to a local VMUG community near you at vmug.com. We have them all over the United States. Feel free to join the chapter. And please use the Q&A function. I know everyone wants to use the general chat, but a lot of questions get lost in there. So use the Q&A function if you have a question. That way we can see who asked it at what time, and we could either answer it. We have people backstage that can answer it, or Joe can answer it live. So use the Q&A function. And lastly, this session is being recorded. The recording will be distributed in a wrap-up email after the webcast and also posted on our YouTube channel. So you will have access to this presentation after the fact. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Tristan. I share up here. Okay. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for attending today's session. I'm really excited to talk about how the Grinch stole ESXi. Today's session is going to be a scattered spider threat actor roundup. So we're going to talk a little bit about the threat group Scattered Spider, a little bit of their ecosystem, tactics, and things like that. And then towards halfway through the presentation, I'm actually going to do a demonstration and kind of show a step-by-step process of how it is that they tend to infiltrate these environments and eventually work their way to the hypervisor and either conduct data theft or ransomware attacks. So it's going to be a really fun one. As Tristan said, please, if you do have questions, use the Q&A function. Stick around for the Q&A afterwards, and I'll get to all the questions that you have. So without further ado, let's get into it. If I can get this thing, there we go. Okay, so Scattered Spider. It's usually a little bit challenging to pin down exactly when these groups come around, but we assessed around 2022, the group is around the time that they formed and started conducting attacks, initially targeting telecoms, BPOs, and whatnot. And right off the bat, it was very apparent that their strong suit was kind of old school hacker techniques. They were using social engineering to conduct that initial access. And frankly, they were really, really good at it, and to this day still are. It started predominantly with standard things like help desk attacks, targeting IT admins, SIM swapping, and then eventually they got a little bit more advanced with some session token hijacking and MFA bypass. But it wasn't until around 2023 when they really got their stride and the high-profile attacks began. That's when they started hitting targets like MGM Resorts, which we'll talk about and reference a little bit later on, Caesars Entertainment, MailChimp, DoorDash, etc., causing exorbitant amounts of damage. Now, following year in 2024, law enforcement was able to make some arrests, take down some of the individuals involved in some of these higher profile attacks. So we saw kind of things cool down for a little bit, but then they just ramped it right back up this past year. It's a major resurgence, seeing ransomware attacks on UK retailers like Marks and Spencer, using DragonForce ransomware, which we'll demonstrate today, and additional targeting of insurance entities and airlines. So in terms of profiling, they go by a lot of names. In cybersecurity, we like to make things a little bit more difficult than we need to, and everyone wants to name them something. But whether you call them, the COM or UNC 3944 or Scattered Spider, it really doesn't matter because their goal is the same as the Grinch. Down on the right there, you see our little graphic is. All they want to do is once they get that access, they're going to steal everything that isn't or sometimes is in fact bolted down. So for further profiling, one of the things that makes them really successful is they're predominantly native English speakers. So very rarely will they have an accent that may give their tactics away. They're able to use local colloquialisms, their grammar and syntax is up to par, and they're able to provide these very convincing verbal pretexts that makes their social engineering a lot more believable. Now, their motives predominantly, it's as one would expect, it's financial gain via this data theft, extortion, and ransomware. However, there's certainly a component of infamy that they tend to enjoy. And these hacker groups like to be well known a little bit. So that's why they have these data leak sites. They'll have Telegram accounts or X accounts that they'll post victims because they kind of enjoy reveling in that infamy and showing off their work. Now, they're not necessarily a fixed group. They're more of a collection of individual operators, similar to what you might imagine anonymous is. And interestingly enough, their assessed ages are pretty young, ranging from 13 to 25 years old, some on the higher end of that spectrum and some lower. But they're very adaptable, and because they, both professionally and literally grew up in the modern day environment, they're very cloud savvy. Instead of focusing on techniques that are, more honed in on traditional infrastructure, they're looking at this newer infrastructure in cloud-based environments, and they're able to leverage identity access management infrastructure and those kind of publicly facing configuration flaws from these third-party entities that get brought into the modern architecture environment. So their tactics I kind of talked about a little bit earlier. They really specialize in that initial access. Things like smishing, vishing, SIM swapping. They'll do the push bombing, also known as the MFA fatigue attacks. And then we've seen, if you look at the top right corner, they're starting to use some more adversary in the middle pages via open source web phishing software. Web phishing software called Evil Jinx. And this allows them to bypass a lot of MFA protections because they're just hijacking session tokens. Once they have that initial access, they're going to conduct their lateral movement and privilege escalation. They've shown a preponderance of the ability to conduct account takeovers, whether it's on the IDP platforms like Entra or Okta or things of that nature, or just kind of your standard domain admin escalation. And then they'll further pivot within that environment by conducting those credential demic attacks. And typically their final attack phase, their actual execution, if there is a VMware infrastructure in that environment, that's where we're starting to see a lot more of these ransomware attacks, which they'll collaborate with other entities to conduct that. But if they're not going to launch ransomware, you can bet that they're definitely going to conduct massive data exfiltration for the purposes of that extortion. And so, in case you didn't know, earlier this year, MITRE published the version 17 of the attack framework, which for the first time they added ESXi matrix. ESXi had its own individual matrix, and the current version now they've updated to version 18. No changes to the ESXi matrix in version 17, but if you haven't taken a look at it, I highly encourage you kind of dig in there and see what MITRE has listed out for us as defenders to see what are attackers doing specifically to target ESXi and that hypervisor layer. Some of these techniques we're going to go over today, they're very comprehensive, so unfortunately we won't have the time to really dig into each one in particular, but we'll definitely demonstrate some of them, and I do encourage you to take a little bit of time afterwards and head over to MITRE, pull up the ESXi matrix, and start looking through those and mapping how that looks in your environment. So with these tactics, right, we'll kind of talk a little bit about their attack chain ecosystem. So Scatter Spider has been observed lately forming a lot of different kind of external partnerships with these ransomware as a service actors. We've seen Ransom Hub, Black Cat, and Alpha, which is what they use for the MGM attack, DragonForce, which they're starting to use a lot more recently. And then they also partner with Shiny Hunters for their initial access. And not on the list here, but what we've seen is that they've also formed up with Lapsus. And in fact, have started forming a new group, which they called the Scattered Lapsus Hunters, which is kind of a amalgamation of the Shiny Hunters, Scattered Spider, and Lapsus group. So Scattered Spider, their portion of this attack chain is that initial access and getting into the environment, whether that's pivoting from previously compromised accounts or credentials into target environment, or just doing it all on themselves, kind of a cradle to grave process. But once they get into the environment and onto either the vCenter appliance or the hypervisors themselves, and they launch that ransomware. Once that encryption is conducted, then they essentially just hand over the remaining negotiation and victim handling process to their partnered entities. So, this being a VMUG event, we got to talk about VMware stuff. And so to really break down why it is that we're seeing these attacks on ESXi specifically, there's a few reasons for that, but a big one is the fact that VMware and Broadcom still make up about 84% of the commercial hypervisor environment. So when you look at it from the context of these kids or these other entities, that this is essentially their day job, and they're going to want to specialize in these kind of environments, it's harder for them to focus on a wide array of different hypervisors when they know that the majority of the attack surface they're going to be exposed to is VMware. So that's why they're getting savvy on it. That's why they're writing their malware to target ESXi, because they know that there's a 84% chance that whatever environment they land in, it's going to end up running ESXi. Now, it is worth noting that although these hypervisors, these other ones like Nutanix, Proxmox, and Citrix, despite the fact that they make up a smaller percentage, we've started seeing, from a threat intelligence perspective, other attackers um, create and tailor their malware to start targeting these other environments too. So it really is this proverbial cat and mouse game that even as defenders decide, maybe small businesses decide, we don't want to go with the ESXi. We're going to stick to Nutanix, right? And they start incorporating that in their environment. Well, now the newest strain of Akira ransomware has functionality to start targeting Nutanix hypervisors. So the overall message there is that it's not a VMware or an ESXi problem. It really is it's a hypervisor issue, and it's the attackers learning the environment and staying malleable in their attack approach. Now, on the right here, you see there's a lot of things that add to this issue, things like credential compromise or misconfigurations or improper firewall rules. But unfortunately, even if you do configure your firewall properly, there's a number of different ways that attackers can still get in and still leverage it. And frankly, the basic message is that firewalls just aren't enough in terms of a protection because they will provide some semblance of that the north-south traffic, but it misses that lateral east-west movement, which we are going to demonstrate today. And unfortunately, once the attackers are in that environment, your firewall is all but moot. So we're going to kind of use this case study, the MGM Resorts breach. It's a little bit older. It's from 2023. But it's a good one in that it really highlights specifically how Scattered Spider does their business. We have a really good breakdown of their whole process throughout there, whereas some of the more recent attacks, we know that they're involved. We know that they encrypted the hypervisors, but the specific attack chain details aren't really publicly available yet. So this is still a great case study for us to go off of in terms of their cradle to grave attack process. And it's kind of what we're going to emulate here today, starting with a multi-phased attack. And the first thing being targeting an IT help desk with that social engineering attack to gain the initial access and initial foothold in the environment. So that's what we're going to do right now. Grinch hacker, Scattered Spider. The Grinch is going to call up IT admin help desk at Whoville Corp and pose as a legitimate employee. And let's listen in and see kind of how that phone call goes.
Hey, Whoville Corp IT department. This is Augustus. How can I help you?
Hi, Augustus. It's Cindy from accounting. Employee ID WH02416. Listen, I really need your help with something. I'm at the airport on the way to a client site for the upcoming Hootropolis Enterprises merger, and I've gotten locked out of my account. Can you please reset my password real quick? I need to access the share drive before my flight takes off.
Huh. Yeah, I think I can help you with that. You'll just need to provide the code from your Authenticator app.
That's the problem. I'm locked out of my Authenticator app as well. Can you please just send me the password? My group is starting to board, and if I don't get this done, Mr. Hubris is going to kill me.
Yeah, okay. Look, let me check. Okay, Cindy, it's I love Max, capital I, capital L, capital M and X, and you put an at symbol as the A.
You're a lifesaver. Thank you so much.
Okay, so it's kind of a silly little example, and when you hear that, you think, I would never fall for that. But the problem is they keep doing it successfully. And then although this is a quick cursory example of, poor practices and this is probably not the best social engineering pretext or, a good, help desk admin with their salt would never fall for it. The fact of the matter is sometimes it's the simplest things that tend to be the most effective. And if it didn't work, they wouldn't be doing it and they wouldn't be doing it successfully. But they continue to successfully breach these large organizations and sometimes smaller ones because it does work. Because unfortunately, people are easy to trick. Now, kind of a fun little, off holiday theme here, but an Easter egg that we included in there is the voice of Cindy is actually our marketing director, Megan. And although that was her voice, she didn't say any of those lines. What I did is I took a 10-second audio clip of her voice and I just put that into a free open source AI voice emulator. And although you could pick up some irregular audio hitches and some things that sounded a little glitchy, it still is passable and it sounds like Megan. And just kind of a fun thing to think about that this is something that I was able to do for free. I a couple minutes, just type something up. And though it may not be a very effective social engineering tactic right now, it's a little bit scary to think where things could go, within the 2 to 5 year time frame of how we've already seen how scary it is that AI is in our environment. So just a fun little thing that we want to sprinkle in there. But okay, so this was phase one, social engineering. And we're going to move from here on to phase two because now the Grinch, with his successful social engineering pretext, has captured credentials and has found a way to kind of bypass that whole MFA solution that Cindy has in her environment. This phased approach that I'm going to be demonstrating for the rest of the attack chain is something that came out from one of Google Mandiant's recent blogs from Help Desk to Hypervisor, where they talk about the phase that Scatter Spider executes in their attack chain. So we kind of borrowed from that. So now that the Grinch has his credentials, he's on his little Grinch box Kali machine here. He's going to open a terminal, and Scatter Spider will use a combination of tunneling and various other kinds of remote connection tools. They've been seen using AnyDesk or TeamViewer for the remote connections, or Teleport SH, Tailscale for the tunneling. But for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to keep it kind of simple, and we're going to use X3 RDP. And we're going to take those credentials and establish a remote connection to Cindy Lou's workstation. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger for y'all. So we can see here Cindy Lou's nice family photo. We could go through her emails or files, do some more enumeration, but for the sake of time, we're going to focus more on some network enumeration and network reconnaissance. So we'll make this a little bit bigger for you. And first thing we want to figure out is where we sit within the networking environment. And so we can see that, okay, we have our IP addressing scheme, and we're on the 167 IP endpoint here. And so now what we're doing is a living off a land attack that Scattered Spider has been observed doing. You can see CISA talks about it. This is a pretty simple one. It's just a for loop, and it's going to ping throughout that subnet, and we're going to filter any sort of time to live responses that we get. And this is going to give us a number of things that might seem innocuous, but is actually helpful information. First, we're able to identify which hosts are live and what their IP addresses are. And then with these time to live, I can actually enumerate, because I know the value 64 corresponds to Linux, and 128 responds to Windows hosts. So now I'm getting a bit of a picture of that network environment by simply using the tools that are already available on any Windows environment, and probably not flagging any kind of Windows Defender or EDR. So now we're going to launch PowerShell, and we're going to broaden our reconnaissance efforts a little bit more. We're actually going to utilize an imported tool. Now, Scattered Spider has been observed using things like Rust Scan or Sharphound EXE or Nmap. And so for this specific example, we're just going to use an Nmap executable. And there's a lot of different kinds of verbose and comprehensive scans you can do. But really all we're going to do is we're going to take these IPs that we just got from our ping scan, and we're going to try and get a little bit more comprehensive information on those hosts to figure out what targets we want to go after. And with this port scan, what ports are open? What services can we potentially leverage to move on to that next phase, which is going to be that privilege escalation. So it takes a little bit. And so, okay, we have our responses here. So the first thing we see here on our 167, we know that's the workstation we're in right now. So that's a Windows 10 host. We move up a little bit, we can see Windows Server 2022 at the 168 endpoint. We can infer that this is probably our domain controller based off of port 88 Kerberos being open. But as we scroll up, we see another interesting one there at an endpoint at the 161 IP. And it's got a few different ports open, SSH is closed, HTTP. But we see that, okay, that's a VMware ESXi host. That's interesting. That's something that Scattered Spider is definitely going to take note of within their environment, because it shows that we have a little bit of a flat network architecture right now, and that they probably shouldn't have immediate access to that host, but that's definitely a high value target for them. So after getting that information, they're definitely going to want to move on to phase 3, which is their targeted privilege escalation. Now, oftentimes they will want to go straight for, try and escalate to either their local admin or see if they can get all the way to a domain administrator and, target domain controller. But there's been other instances where if they discover any sort of, vSphere environment or vCenter admin or ESXi admin account, they might forego that domain controller access altogether and instead want to target the ESXi hypervisor to get that big payday. And that's what they're going to do here. So now that we know that we have an ESXi host readily available, because we have this remote desktop connected session, they're going to use something called Luma Stealer, which is an info stealing malware. And just like that, it runs very, very quickly. This is one of the ones they use, that or Vidar Stealer or Raccoon Stealer. But they launch that and immediately they get a results folder in their home directory. And we can see that this malware successfully pulled a cached password from the browser on this host. And as we look at that, we can see that the username root and the password logged in at that 161 endpoint UI. So that's good news for us. As simple as that, launching that malware now, we have been able to gain root credentials from that endpoint. So with that, they're going to move on to phase 4, which is the ESXi access and discovery. So with those credentials in hand, our Grinch hacker is going to go back to his remote session. He can go ahead and close that out right now. He's going to open that web browser and navigate over to that 161 endpoint. And okay, so that is an ESXi, the DCUI itself, not a vCenter account, but that's still good. You have direct access to the hypervisor. And he's going to input those credentials that he just got from his info stealing malware. Once logged in, we can see that it's actually a 7.0 build, not a 6.0, so unmapped out at close, but not perfect. But now he can start enumerating. He sees configuration information over here on the right. He can move up to see virtual machines, and we have 2 database servers, looks like, VMs. Definitely interesting targets that we're going to want to come back to a little bit later. But right now, we're still kind of doing that discovery. We can see the data store, which we will also utilize a little bit later. Now, if you go up to manage and packages, you can see all the software packages that are installed. We can go to advanced settings, and up here, he can do something and look for a specific kind of setting that might give them trouble. And if you look here, he searches for something called exec installed only. And for those that don't know, exec installed only is a feature on ESXi, which if you can read the middle column there, the description essentially says that when this is enabled, which as you can see in the value to the right, it says value true, so it is enabled on this host. When this is enabled, the only kind of executables that you're able to run or execute on this hypervisor have to be installed via a VIP, right? A vSphere installation bundle, essentially saying that this has been validated and signed by VMware and proven that it's not malicious. It's signed by their certificate. You're good to go. Anything that isn't that will not get executed on the hypervisor. So from an attacker perspective, that's problematic. That's certainly something that I want to know about, and as the Grinch, I want to be able to address. But it's something that we'll come back to a little bit later. So we'll make a mental note of that. Okay, so this is enabled. We can go over here. We see our users. We have the root user account, which we are using in ESX admin. We could change those credentials if we want, but for now, we're going to stay quiet. And the last thing we're going to look at is see what services are actively running, which ones are stopped, and see if there's any corresponding firewall rules to those services. So at this point, the Grinch and Scattered Spider have concluded their phase 4. They've accessed the hypervisor. They've conducted some discovery enumeration, and they have a good idea of what that environment looks like. Now we're going a little bit fast here, but typically when they get here, they're gonna kind of stay in that environment for a bit and see what those regular operations look like, and see what kind of security features are presently installed on that hypervisor. Once they're comfortable with that, then they're going to move on to phase 5, which is going to be continued persistence as well as defense evasion. So at this point, what I want to do is I'm going to activate the ESXi shell and the SSH services on the hypervisor, because I'm going to want to use those here for this next portion of defense evasion. I'll exit out of these little boxes. Now, as I alluded to earlier, if I want to for persistence, I could add a whole nother user account with a password that I control, but we'll skip that process for now because it's pretty rudimentary. So SSH into the hypervisor itself with the credentials that we have. Pass that uname tag, you just confirm, yes, we are in fact in the right hypervisor. And then from here, kind of a standard ESXi host, nothing too crazy. But the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pass a series of 3 different kind of commands. And the first thing that we're going to kind of be targeting is we want to disable logging. This is something that Scattered Spider regularly does when they land in these environments, is they want to disable this logging. And we're using ESXi, setting configurations in the system log. First thing is we're just making the log directory, the temp file, a non-persistent directory. The next thing we're going to do is with these the syslog configuration, we're going to set the log host at a null value. And this is just a way of kind of disabling system logging. There's a lot of other ways you could do this. We get an error. It's not actually, it's kind of a false positive error because this still successfully goes through. and then we reload this system log here. And so for all intents and purposes, now we have disabled logging, and we can move forward with the rest of our defense evasion. The next thing we're going to go ahead and do is that firewall we talked about, we're just going to disable it. And even though we could be a little bit quieter and pick which ports we want to go through, there's times where you can just take it all down together, and who cares, because you're about to make a whole lot of noise anyway with a ransomware attack. And then finally, that pesky setting that I talked about, exec installed only, that security feature, we can just pass this one-liner and say, yeah, I want to disable that because I want to be able to run my malware on this hypervisor. And we can confirm that actually, that command did work by going back over to advanced settings. We refresh it, we research just exec, and now you can see in that center column that value has now changed to false, which means as an attacker, I've got the green light to go ahead and start executing whatever malware I want to on this system. And that kind of further illustrates that you can have great security on your hypervisor, but all it takes is a credential compromise, and all these awesome configurations and settings you have can go away just like that. And so now at this point, the attacker is ready to move on to their sixth and final phase, which is going to be the data exfiltration as well as that ransomware attack. So at this point, they're going to move over to the VMFS volumes data store directory. We list that out. We can see we've got an ISO on the right as well as our two database VMs right there. And we can CD into the first data store and list that out. And what we see here are a bunch of VMDK and VMX files. These are the virtual machine hard disk files that essentially run that VM. And what Scattered Spider has been observed doing sometimes is, in terms of their data exfiltration, if, let's say, for example, the domain controller is a hosted VM, they may actually exfiltrate all these VMDK files and either create their own domain, like replicate the domain controller of this environment within their own environment, or they will create a rogue VM that's unmonitored within vCenter and use that rogue VM and rebuild the domain controller from there. And then they dump the ntts.dit table. They do their credential dumping that way. We're going to skip that whole process mainly because these VMDK files are rather large. So, oh, sorry, I skipped through a little bit. They're rather large, so I don't want you guys to sit here and watch me download files forever. But what we are going to do is kind of skip forward to the ransomware attack. So if we go over here to the data store area, this is typically where you go to register a VM. But the problem with this data store browser is that it's an unrestricted file upload. So what I can do is I can just upload my DragonForce ransomware right to the data store browser. And instead of using wget or something like that, I can just use the hypervisor against itself. And there you can see that I have my DragonForce ransomware sample right there, ready to go. I could detonate it from here, but it's a little easier to move it over to the root directory. So we'll go ahead and do that right now. We'll list it out, and you can see, yep, there's our DragonForce ransomware sample. We're going to make this executable with our chmod plus X. And then from here, we're just going to go ahead and launch the ransomware attack against this hypervisor. We're going to target the VMFS directory because that's where all those VMDK files reside. We get a little bit of a verbose output. As you scroll up here, you can see this is a live sample, so we do have unique keys that are generated for this. There's a default delay of about 20 seconds. And interestingly enough, it actually does whitelist certain file paths and other files just to prevent bricking the entire system as a whole. But now very quickly, now you can see once that 20 seconds is up, we started encrypting everything, all the VMDK files, all the VMX files. It's going to attempt to turn off the VMs to ensure that those VMDK files are unlocked for that encryption, which you see here. In this example, they were already turned off, so it didn't really need to do that. But just like that, we launched that ransomware attack, and it moves very, very quickly. So when we list this out, you can see that it dropped an encryption log right underneath the DragonForce ransomware sample. If we go a bit deeper to our volumes and data store directory, now you can see that ISO that we had, that's been encrypted. And then if we go a little bit deeper into our database one VM directory, you can see that all the VMDK files, all of the VMX files, everything has been encrypted. And we have our ransomware note there. And we cap that out, and you can see that there's instructions now of handling that ransomware negotiation process. So at this point, as the Grinch or Scattered Spider, I've successfully conducted my whole operation from that initial access to that ransomware attack. And at this point, what I'm going to do is hand over negotiations to the DragonForce ransomware as a service organization. And my job here is done. But unfortunately for the Who's at Whoville Corp, they're about to have a very, very, very bad Christmas. So what is it that we need to do to defend against Grinch or Scattered Spider and to save Christmas? Well, first off, you want to patch your environments. I know it's a lot easier said than done, especially with these mission critical loads, but with every new version of ESXi or other VMware products that comes out, there's new security features that can really address a lot of these problems. So patching is probably solution number one. Number two, hardening and network segmentation kind of go together in this example. There's some things that the Whoville Corp unfortunately just did not do very well. A lot of that is just poor practices. Their IT admin on the help desk, he violated a pretty straightforward procedure. So that's easily addressable. Another thing is, your flat network as well as admins logging into ESXi host from a workstation. That's pretty poor practice. We all know those are things you shouldn't do. Unfortunately, they do still happen, but those are pretty easily solved as well. And that you really want your hypervisor treated as a tier 0 asset, segment it from the rest of the network, really treat that as a bastion. You have to protect that thing as much as possible. However, if you think back, once the Grinch actually got access to the hypervisor, there was really no glaring security issues. The firewall was in place, it had its rules. The ESXi shell and SSH were disabled, so that's a good practice. And exec installed only was installed. All the things that they did in terms of actual protecting the hypervisor were good and common practices. However, like what we saw is it just isn't enough. And so that's why at Vali Cyber, we believe that you want to have a defense in depth. And in order to accomplish that, you have to have a runtime protection for the hypervisor itself. And so that's where ZeroLock comes in. And I'll briefly kind of talk about some of the stuff that ZeroLock does and how it would be able to protect this kind of attack. But because it's really not the main focus of this webinar, I'm only going to talk about the two things within this, our little defense in depth onion here, which is SSH MFA and application filtering. But what ZeroLock does is it gives you that multi-layered approach to protecting these KVM-based hypervisors and specifically ESXi. We prevent attacks through a series of different protective measures that culminate in that real-time protection, along with a lightweight AI behavioral detection engine that gives you automated remediation. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is, what would have happened if the folks at Whoville Corp had ZeroLock in their environment when the Grinch enabled SSH and tried to log in there. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this SSH MFA solution. So this is the ZeroLock management console kind of dashboard right here. You can see a bunch of things from alerts to endpoints that we're protecting. So in this environment, it's very similar to the Whoville environment. We have an ESXi 7 host right here. If we move over to that host, it's a little bit different because instead of our database VMs, we have our Frodo, Gimli, and Gandalf VMs. But essentially, it's the same architecture. Now, if the attacker enabled SSH and had the credentials to try to log in, but ZeroLock was in place, you can see they're immediately confronted with something a little bit different because now they have to provide a ZeroLock username, as well as now they're prompted for an MFA code from a standard authenticator app. We support things like Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, Okta, you name it. But that's another layer of complexity that the attack chain that I just did wouldn't have worked because although I was able to compromise Cindy Lou's credentials and I had root credentials, I did not have a mechanism of which I could actually compromise the actual administrator's MFA solution. So that in and of itself is going to create a significant delay and a significant headache for that attacker and may very well have prevented this ransomware attack altogether. So the next thing we're going to talk about here is application filtering. Now, as you recall, I used the database, the data store browser to import malware, the DragonForce malware, onto the host. And here we're going to do something a little bit similar, but instead, I have a Defray 777 malware hosted on a file server that I own, and I'm going to use a wget command. But the rest is pretty much the same, right? I get the malware onto the host, I'm going to chmod exit, and then I'm going to try to run that ransomware sample itself. But when I do that, you're going to see something a little bit different because I have my SSH session enabled and now I immediately get kicked off. And this was ZeroLock's application allow listing filter in action. You can see over here that it blocked this executable hash. It shows me all the processes that and the files that were, the files that were messed with and the processes that were utilized during this attack. And you can see you have kind of a forensic timeline in which you can see all the processes and the files that were affected. And how this essentially works is when you install ZeroLock on the host itself, or on the hypervisor itself, it's going to make a catalog of all the binaries that were already on that host prior to ZeroLock being there. And that creates that allow list. So then despite disabling exec installed only or any of these other features, once you bring in something that isn't in that allow list, ZeroLock will not allow it to run. So that's just another way that this attack could have been thwarted if the Who's had ZeroLock in their environment. Okay, so last thing, and I didn't really talk a whole lot of Shodan, but I'll touch on it briefly. This is it's Google for hackers, right? And what it does is it crawls and it indexes through the internet to see any sort of publicly available or publicly facing systems. And what I highly encourage you to do is verify that your network segmentation is actually done well and done correctly. Because the last time I looked at Shodan, there was around 30,000 publicly facing ESXi hosts. So if you get nothing else out of this presentation, please, we at Vali Cyber, we really care about hypervisor security. Even if you don't go with our product or even if you don't do anything, like take the time to please ensure that your hypervisors are segmented away from the world to see. Otherwise, it could potentially be a very big risk that you're putting your organization under. So with that, I will go ahead and pause for any questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Hey, Joe, thanks so much. That was amazing. That was my voice, and that was really creepy. But that was an interesting thing to see. Let's see. We've got a question from John asking if ZeroLock also works on VCF 9.
Yes. So we play very well with VMware. We have a signed VIP from them. So every time these new kind of features or products come out, we ensure that we adhere to these processes. But yeah, we work hand in hand with VMware and Broadcom. So currently we work in all posted environments.
Awesome. Question from Garrett. Are there any current guardrails preventing someone from falling for these AI voice scams?
Yeah, great question. So what I will say is from a threat intelligence perspective, I haven't seen any large scale attacks leverage this AI voice scamming. You hear kind of rumor mills, you hear security research people talk about it. I believe it's a little bit more common with kind of daily scams, people trying to, scam someone's grandparents or elderly folks or things like that. So it typically will target individuals for the purpose of like that short-term monetary gain, as opposed to larger organizations that face ransomware attacks. However, the short answer is there's not that I'm aware of. I don't want to talk out of turn, but I don't know if there's any sort of automated tool that you can onboard in your environment that would prevent that. However, the human really is that first line of defense. So typically there's going to be those common themes that I kind of put there on the slide of they're going to try to be urgent. They're going to try to get you to violate procedure in some way. They're going to try to make these IT admins step outside what they should do, and they're just going to provide reasonings to it. So kind of a long roundabout way of saying is like, even though there aren't necessarily automated tools to detect it, as long as people are trained to know what to look for, it doesn't matter who it sounds like or any of that kind of stuff. Once the alarm bells kind of start ringing in that IT admin's head, that should be the first line of defense there to then I really need to stick with procedure. So I think the long answer to your question is training is the best tool available right now in terms of preventing that, awareness and training.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's sad to see like just kind of how much of a focus this is becoming. There was an article in the Register recently. I'm going to share that link to the webinar chat right now for you guys to see. And it's just showing that there's been a 700% increase in hypervisor attacks. And it's just astronomical. It's just becoming more and more a thing. So I think as much as, folks are able to train their IT teams about what to look for, what to be aware of, it can really only benefit you. And I know it can be so hard when, those teams are also trained to be helpful and, to try to help people solve their problems. And so no one wants to be the person to say no, but sometimes saying no is the right choice.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, we had a hand raised from, uh-oh, you went away. Let's see.
I think I saw it.
Ian, I see you raised your hand. If you've got a question, feel free. We've got our Q&A going as well as our chat window available to post any questions that you may have. Let's see. I don't see any additional questions. I was just curious, Joe, from your perspective, we're hearing a lot more about hypervisor being a focus. We're also hearing things coming out of Gartner, like there's going to be a security trend shift towards preemptive security, as opposed to, say, like detection and response in 2026. As a threat intel professional, what do you think? What do you think the landscape might hold for 2026? Do you think that folks at Gartner on track with the preemptive stuff? Do you think Scattered Spider is going to continue? I know this is just all totally theoretical right now. This is just us chatting, but while folks are seeing if they've got any additional questions, just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trend in general, to break it down in a very simplistic sense, and why hypervisors just continuously get attacked and why there is this 700% uptick, is that from an attacker perspective, there's a lot more defenses out there now than there used to be. And, people get beat over the head with it all the time of poor practices and this and that. But really, like, as a whole, the industry has a lot of solutions. There's a lot of really good practices. There's a lot of things that people are putting in place to make it difficult for attackers. So what the trend is the attackers are just going to kind of follow that path of least resistance. And historically, over the past few years, that has been hypervisors. It's kind of that forgotten appliance that, once configured, people don't know a lot about it, and they kind of just ignore it. It goes into the shed and it collects dust, essentially. That's that back door that, attackers want to leverage and go after. So it's tough to say specifically, what it ends up being that they will, what trends will continue. But I do think that the path of least resistance is the easy answer. So if you put on your bad guy hat, right, and you look at your own environment, your own infrastructure and architecture as to if I wanted to attack this thing, am I going to try to go to the front door that has all these other EDR solutions and have all this, very robust defenses, or am I going to find the thing that's kind of neglected that people don't really pay a lot of attention to? And so that is where that proactive defense comes in, because even though, it may not be a compliance requirement, or even though you may not previously have had, budget for these kinds of defenses, recognizing what's going on in the environment, what's probably going to continue within the industry, is a good way to enact that proactive defense and be like, we're going to harden this as much as possible before anything bad happens. So I think that
that makes sense. I mean, I can definitely see taking the path of least resistance. It just really stinks that for a lot of folks that the more vulnerable thing is also so critical to their infrastructure. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us here today. I don't see any additional questions. Everyone who's attended, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we will be back in January with our CTO, Austin Gadiant, as he goes over the 2026 trends and landscape as we see it. Oh, one last question. Sorry, making sure we answer all of them. Question from Ian. Does ZeroLock self-monitor, i.e. flagging an alert to IT if it's turned off by an inside actor?
Great question, Ian. So there are a few different things that we have. The short answer is yes, we do have that capability. Part of the that onion that I didn't get to, right, because it would take a long time to kind of talk about all the capabilities of ZeroLock, but it does have an anti-tamper engine. So we specifically monitor and look for things that are going to attempt to turn off ZeroLock, attempt to modify it in any way. And by doing so, we also have a capability in which, like, you can alert or you can send email alerts or notifications based off of certain alerts that we have within that environment. So yes, we absolutely can do that. I would encourage you, like, reach out to either Megan or myself, or go on the valleycyber.com website. We have an info@valleycyber.com. You can email if you have any specific questions and want to learn more about Zerlock as a whole. But yeah, we have a handful of different kind of self-defense capabilities in that manner.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much to VMUG for hosting us. And once again, we wish you all a happy and safe and scattered spider-free holiday season. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.